Canada's agri-food system is complex and its future depends on bold thinking and open dialogue. The Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute is an independent think tank bringing together diverse voices to advance future-looking policy solutions. By providing a trusted space for conversation, CAPI helps ensure growth and prosperity for the sector. Visit capi-icpa.ca to learn more.
Good afternoon. My name is Tyler McCann, and I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Before we begin our discussion today, I want to acknowledge that I'm participating in this webinar from Western Quebec, located on the traditional unceded and surrendered territory of the Anishinaabe-Algonquin people. CAPI recognizes that we need to take many steps on our road to reconciliation with our First Nations communities across the country, and it's a journey that we must continue to reflect on and take together, especially in light of a challenging and dynamic year that lies ahead. Veuillez noter que si vous avez besoin d'une interprétation simultanée, vous pouvez cliquer sur le bouton Wordly sur votre écran et sélectionner la langue de votre choix. Pour supprimer Wordly de votre écran, veuillez sélectionner Ouvrir, cliquez sur la flèche en haut à droite, puis sélectionner Réduire. To remove Wordly from your screen, please select Open, click the pop-out arrow on the top right, and select Minimize. Canadian agriculture and food face big challenges with the potential for very different solutions that lead to very different outcomes for the sector. Dialogue and debate are essential to getting better policy outcomes. Instead of shying away from thoughtful debate, we think we should embrace it. To advance CAPI's mission of advancing policy solutions, the Ag Policy Exchange webinar series offers a platform for respectful debate, a dialogue to explore diverse perspectives on critical policy issues. Today's Ag Policy Exchange asks the question, what does 2026 look like for Canadian agriculture and food? All of CAPI's work is made possible thanks to the support of partners who know that agriculture and agri-food can do more and that policy plays a critical role in unlocking the sector's potential. Today's webinar was funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnerships Agri-Competitiveness Program. We're also pleased that this webinar is part of our ongoing partnership with RealAgriculture. Working together, we're excited to bring more of these conversations to people working on farms, across the industry, civil society, and governments, across multiple platforms, so that we can contribute to a more competitive, sustainable, and resilient agri-food sector in Canada. For more information on upcoming content, please visit realagriculture.com or CAPI's website. Now, before we begin our webinar today, we'd like to hear from you. We're going to share a poll to ask for your thoughts, asking you what best describes your outlook for Canadian agriculture and food in 2026. This looks like a year where change, where the rubber will hit the road, where pressures from trade, from climate, from innovation, from investment, and beyond will come and impact the sector. And so we're going to dive into that today, trying to set the stage from a farm sentiment, economic, political, and policy perspective for what lies ahead. And hopefully we'll get a sense as to where the leaders that are going to be on our webinar today think that the sector is going to go. So we look forward to hearing what you, the audience, thinks and whether or not you see this as a positive year, a resilient year, a challenging year, or a volatile year ahead. And with that, we see almost half of the people here think that 2026 will be resilient, but the sector is going to be under sustained pressure. And just over a third, though, see it as a challenging year where we're going to be constrained by risks and fiscal limits. So thank you very much. We'll see whether or not our panelists agree with the discussion today. We're going to start with an overview of the Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index. Shaun Haney recorded a clip earlier. We're going to be joined by Lyndsey from RealAgriculture shortly, but we'll start with a video recorded by Shaun Haney providing an update on the Canadian Farm Sentiment Index.
It's great to be with you here today, and we had a lot of stuff to talk about in a very short period of time. Right off the top, Shaun Haney, the founder of RealAgriculture, I want to thank you for joining this webinar. And the other thing I want to do is thank our Real Agri Studies Insights panel. I'm going to show you some data. It's right out of the mouth of the farmer. We had 572 farmers complete our survey in a very short period of time last week. I want to thank them because without those farmers completing our survey work at Real Agri Studies, we wouldn't have information like this to really understand how the farmer is thinking and acting in a pretty challenging environment in 2026. So let's have a look here. What is the data telling us? When we think about the 2026 season, many farmers are going to say to you, there's a lot of risk out there. For the past 3 years in January, we've been asking Canadian farmers, when it comes to the upcoming production year, is this year less risky, same amount of risk, or more risky than the year prior? And we've been doing this for 3 years. When we see heading into the 2026 season, 75% of Canadian farmers and ranchers believe this year is more risky than last year. It was about the same number when we asked this in 2025, and it was pretty much the same number we asked in 2024. So we continue to see farmers' perception of the business environment continues to increase from a risk perspective. When we ask Canadian farmers about, okay, let's just have an outlook for the overall general agricultural economy in Canada. The next 12 months, will we have widespread good times or widespread bad times when it comes to the Canadian ag economy? This chart shows the red line, which is neutral. Anything below that red line is negative. Anything above is positive in our index. It's a scale of 0 to 200. And we can see that we're trending quite low at 42 in January of 2026. And this is kind of pretty much flat over the last 12 months. We were 36 in January of 25, and we basically have gone nowhere in the last 12 months. Our highest ever in this index was January of 2023. So overall, farmers look at the economy, they're feeling a little bit poor when it comes to what is in front of us from just an overall general sense. So we ask Canadian farmers, okay, let's talk about your financial situation. What's your current financial assessment? How would you describe your financial position? This is a snapshot moment in time here right now in January. And this is a bit of a concerning trend. What we're seeing is we started asking this question in April of 25. It was 57% of Canadian farmers and ranchers said, you know what, my financial position is good to excellent. And so we're incorporating the income statement, the balance sheet, cash position, just overall financial assessment. 57% in April said good to excellent. In July, it dipped a little bit lower at 55%. By the time we got to October, we're at 45% saying good to excellent. And very concerningly, we are seeing in January of 26, that number has dropped to 37% of Canadian farmers and ranchers believing their financial position is good to excellent. We have really deteriorated here for a number of reasons that we'll get into in a second, but it's definitely a real this speaks very in parallel to what I'm hearing. It aligns very much with what I'm hearing from not only our Real Ag radio audience, RealAgriculture.com audience, but definitely some of the speeches I've been giving across the country. So just and this isn't like a written in stone forever thing. This is from October and asking the same question, okay? And what we've seen is the larger the farm, based on revenue, the better you feel about your financial situation. You see, over 5 million revenue in October, 22% said, hey, it's excellent. 48% said good. And you can see on the left-hand side that how it's dropping, the blue bar gets bigger as the farms get larger. That is their assessment of their financial situation. Just want to point that out to you. We're definitely seeing differences here across the different types of farms. If you look at people that are just straight cropping, primarily crops, only 12% think they're better off financially today versus a year ago. When we look at both mixed farms, like both crops and livestock, it's 18%, slightly better on a mixed farm. It's the people that are all in on livestock that feel the best about their financial situation. 46% of them feel their financial position today is better than a year ago. Only 20% believe it's worse. Okay, you can see the divergence between those two groups. So one of the challenges we've had is that crop prices have really kind of rolled over. We got corn and beans and wheat really providing a lot of challenges in the marketplace. Canola's really bounced around based on some of the tariffs. There's been a lot of challenges in the grain market in North America, indeed. Okay, so prices have rolled over. They're weaker. But what we're seeing here is that October and in January, the last two surveys we've done, Canadian farmers are pretty bullish in terms of their outlook in the direction of the markets going forward. There's a number of reasons that would justify that, but overall, I think the numbers speak for itself. This is the only positive number in all of our Canadian Farmer Sentiment Index, by the way, is the direction of the markets in front of us. So with all this, I mentioned risk and 75% of Canadian farmers believing this year is more risky than last year. What are we doing from a risk management standpoint? Here's the thing I want to point out to you. We only have 52% of Canadian farmers and ranchers in agri-stability, according to our research panel. Interestingly enough, the larger the farm, the more likely you are to be involved in agri-stability. 72%. So remember, 52% is the general number. 72% of farms over $5 million in revenue are in agri-stability. So we talked about the direction of prices, but what about the costs? And let's get to this really quickly here. The blue bars are fertilizer production expenses. Farmers are pointing out all the time, fertilizer prices suck. They are really high. They're bad. They're bad relative. Fertilizer prices have held. The blue bar, you can see how we've troughed in the last couple of years. We kind of laid flat. That is different than what you would see in the crop prices, which has really fallen off. A crop like corn has probably dropped about, say, 35%, and fertilizer prices have held at the same levels, or maybe are just a little bit higher depending on where you are. As a percentage of expenses, and this is American data, but it holds over to Canada based on people I've talked to. As a percentage of expenses, fertilizer actually is going down, meaning the entire cost complex is rising, and that's the challenge the farmer is facing right now in 2026. Poor crop prices or lower crop prices and expenses continue to rise, and that's why we have the negative margins that we're seeing for the most part across the country. On the cropping side, obviously, like I said before, beef is different story. So what are farmers doing? They are cost cutting. We're seeing obviously a reduction in machinery purchases. This is one thing Canadian farmers did not follow through on last year compared to their neighbors to the south. They're talking about slowing technology upgrades, looking for lower operating interest rates, doing some refinancing, reducing specialty products, using more generics, just trying to find ways. Now, a lot of these, for the most part, are variable costs, except for the machinery. It would be a fixed cost. And this is one of the challenges, farmers trying to make sure they've got the right break even, an accurate break even to make some of these decisions. And that's where a lot of the challenges kind of lie here in 26 for sure. When we think about the big challenges on the horizon, we asked Canadian farmers in October about, trade. And how would you rate your level of concern regarding trade with the following countries? No surprises. Canadian farmers very concerned about three major partners, the United States, China, and India, for a number of different reasons. And of course, the big thing in front of the Canadian government is to try to negotiate through this CUSMA review that is going to happen. There are some challenges there, but we should feel, I think, confident at the end of the day. Hopefully we have some sort of agreement. Maybe it look different, but it's really important to the industry of agriculture that we do have a CUSMA agreement, whatever that looks like, on the other side of these negotiations. And you can see the stark drop-off once we get into the other countries and trading partners in the world. Finally, this isn't a part. I've been hearing a lot of questions about banking and access to capital, and can you get it? This is a big issue in Canada and the United States. We asked Canadian farmers and ranchers, to what degree do you feel you'll be able to access the capital you need from your lender this upcoming season? 52% saying extremely likely, 30% saying somewhat likely, 14% may or may not, and 3% not very likely at all. And 1% saying, nah, not likely at all, period. So I'd be interested in hear some of the other commentators, what they think of this data. But this is the first time we've asked this question, so I don't have a reference point historically, but definitely something to keep an eye on as we head into the rest of this year and beyond. So I want to thank everybody and the opportunity to be with you here today and participate. And I just want to say good luck with the rest of the webinar, and please check out realagriculture.com and realagristudies.com for more data just like this. The full data set is coming out next week, so stay tuned for that. Back to the webinar.
And thank you to Shaun for providing that recording, that overview of what they're hearing or the perspectives of farmers looking ahead to 2026. Now, let's get into some of the perspectives of the economics with Lyndsey Smith, editor at RealAgriculture.com, who will be interviewing Desmond Sobool, the director of economics and deputy chief economist at Farm Credit Canada. Over to Lyndsey and Des.
All right. Thank you, Tyler. Really appreciate that. And great to see that overview from Shaun of the CFSI. There was a question in the Q&A. I did send the link to Real Agri Studies, which is where CFSI lives, and added some details there if anyone's curious about the demographics for some of those questions. That's in the Q&A. But without further ado, welcome here, Des. We get to cover the economic side of this Outlook question. I'm going to start off, and we've got some great graphics to go through. We've got some of the main topics that we're absolutely going to cover, but I want to start with, in looking at the poll as we started this webinar, that was more optimistic than I thought we would be. If you could sum up your outlook for 2026 in one word, what would it be?
Thanks for everyone joining. I would say the one word would be uncertainty. And so, that's something we faced in 2025. We're going to face that again this year. I was really pleased to see in the poll that resilience did show up because we look back over the ag cycle over the last 2 decades, through different disease, other, economic factors that have come into play. And resilience is the one thing that I would say is that optimism in the industry. People need to eat. And so it's good to see that. I'm glad that resilience was the number one in the poll. Shaun touched on trade, and as an export nation, trade is front and center to both agriculture and food and finding those export markets. And so, the figure on the screen here, you can see really what the impact of those tariffs and those trade disruptions have had on Canada, whether it's the US, China, India, those top three. You can see our trade overall, from January 2025 to November, trade data just came out this morning, 15% drop on a dollar basis. So this is a combination of both lower prices as well as lower volumes. And you can see in the United States, not surprising, that's down 28%. So when you think beyond agriculture and food of those sectors of automobiles, steel, aluminum, softwood lumber, with very, very punitive tariffs, you can see the impact it's having on the Canadian exports. I'd say the good news from this, which you can see in the slide though, is I said, diversification is starting to materialize. You can see the rest of the world, we're actually seeing that uptick. That's increased 35% from January through to November of 2025. So Canada is finding those other markets. I know the federal government is really focused on trade missions, signing agreements. There are existing agreements in place as well where we're seeing those tariffs being reduced. So that's got to be front and center, to continue to build those partnerships, those agreements with other countries to help limit our exposure to the US, because we can see how material those tariffs are. And we are, as an export nation, very exposed to the US market. The good thing for agriculture and food, and that's on the next slide here, is most of the goods that are flowing between Canada and the US fall under CUSMA are tariff-free. So I think it's nearly 100% for agriculture, and for food commodities, you're looking at probably 97, 98%. So it's a very good news story on that aspect. And we can still see that, trade with the US has declined somewhat, down about 3%. Overall, it was a bit of a volatile year. Trade is up 9% overall. And you can see the rest of the world is up 25%. So you can see that our products are finding those alternative markets. Really good news that Canada did reach an agreement with China to reopen, the market access for canola seed. I know the tariff is reduced down to 15%. And canola meal, there's an agreement through from March 1st to the end of the year. That's really good news for the canola meal sector as well. So that's good news that we're starting to find some of those agreements to have less of that exposure to the US, because we just don't know what's going to happen. And Shaun did talk about CUSMA. That's front and center this year. There's a lot of noise coming out of the White House, and it's very loud. And there's these threats of if Canada signs a deal with China, they're going to put 100% tariff on all Canadian exports. So you hear all of that coming out. It's very concerning. I think the good news is, when you look at some of the reports that have been sent to Congress about CUSMA and stakeholder feedback, is it's resoundingly favorable. People in the US, producers, processors, like CUSMA. They see the benefits. the integrated supply chains. So it's good news that you're actually seeing it more in that, I'd say on the ground level, the value of those trade agreements. They want it to be extended. There are a few pain points in it, that are, I think there's a few things that are called out. But I think overall, I think the sentiment is it's a good deal. It's a good agreement between the countries. It's just separating what's coming out of the White House versus what's happening, on the ground level.
So, and I want to hold on this for just a moment. And honestly, we could do a whole webinar on Kuzma. There's going to be a whole webinar on Kuzma. So sign up for that because we could, and it does take up a lot of oxygen in the room for very good reason. Does, and that's one of the things I did want to touch on. You mentioned, that for the most part, agricultural goods are covered under Kuzma, and so they can flow freely across the border. Separating the noise and the politics from the fundamentals and business getting done in a day. I do want to just for a moment though put some parameters around like just how important Kuzma is, that we do review and renew at some point this year, maybe not exactly in early July, but that we do end up with a renewal. Just how important is it to agriculture and agri-food?
It's critical, and I think Shaun in his sentiment showed how important trade is and how it has the impact on the producer. So you see sentiment is low, the outlook is pessimistic. There's just a lot of concern. It's that uncertainty. How do you plan? How do you make investments when you don't know what the future holds? And so having that agreement in place, having it renewed and signed, will provide that certainty. We have seen investment, business investment sentiment is low in Canada, and it is low as well for producers. So now they're saying now is not a good time to invest because I don't know what's going to happen. So this agreement is critical to keep those goods flowing. Those supply chains, like I said, are very integrated. We need to have an agreement signed, something very similar to what we have today. I don't, what I've read and what I've heard is they're not looking for major changes.
Right.
So you kind of separate what's coming out of the White House and the noise, but I think at the end of the day, for the producers in the U.S. and the processors, they know how good of a deal this is for them and how they rely on Canada, regardless of what President Trump says that they don't need Canada. Well, they do need Canada. We have a lot of products that flow to the U.S. that those producers and processors are very dependent on.
All right, so that does bring us though to our next slide, which is on GDP, and this is of course. I'll be honest, Des, I've been looking for the good news slide that you've got to share, and I don't know that we have one. But this has been a concern, a discussion, and as the numbers play out, it's still a concern. And definitely a challenge. So where are we at on GDP? What are the factors that go into, resulting in this number?
Yeah, so this is not a good news slide for sure. And so you see, the estimate for 2025 was GDP about 1.7. Well, that's below the potential of the economy, which is usually around that 2% mark. And then for this year, it's been, our forecast is GDP will be 1%. The Bank of Canada just had their monetary policy report and policy rate announcement yesterday. Their outlook is about 1.1% for 2026. So the economy is slowing, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that, on the labor front. I know recent job numbers that came out near the end of the year looked fairly optimistic. But if you look at the entire year, it was one of the worst for job creation in over a decade, both full-time and total employment. So we're seeing that weakness. That's dragging on the economy. We know that the tariffs and those trade disruptions are weighing on the economy as well. And sentiment, our economy, about 60% of our economy is consumer spending money. And if consumers are, if they're losing their jobs or they're not sure what's happening, they may not be spending as much money. So that's weighing on the economy as well. I'd say the good news, it's not in the slide, but into 2027, we're forecasting it's going to rebound. There's a lot of investment from the federal government looking at to create that trade diversification opportunity. So logistics, railways, ports, all of that will help to boost the economy as well. It just will take some time. So this year's going to be tough from a GDP standpoint. And this is why, if we go to the next slide, when you look at the Bank of Canada policy rate, our forecast is, like I said, they held the rate constant at 225 basis points yesterday. We're going against market consensus. we think that Bank Canada is going to have to step in the later half of the year to help provide some stimulus to the economy based on that 1% growth, and that the economy will really be underperforming. So I would say this is a decent news story if you have debt. It's going to become more affordable if the Bank of Canada continues to cut rates to help support the economy. So I'd say there's a little bit of good news here in that variable rate debt will become a little bit less expensive.
So you're telling me there are people without debt. Got it. Okay. No,
Yeah, I'm
this
not
is
one of them, so there
exactly
might be.
right. But this is, and so this I find this is an interesting point here is that there does seem to be at least some room to go lower, even though we held, and we'll see how that plays out. Now, okay. Now and we've got a few minutes left here. If we can go to the next slide, I think there's one more point on this
Yeah.
to touch on, and then I want to talk about currency because I
Okay.
think this is the currency question is one that I'm hearing about far more. And I know that there are people that probably spend their entire careers focused on currency moves and where they go. And sometimes it can be overwhelming, but we're going to unpack some of it. So,
Okay.
so this is maybe just walk us through this and then we'll talk currency.
Okay. So yeah, before we get to currency, this is the other side of the interest rates discussion, and this is that fixed rates. And so those are tied to government bonds. And this figure shows when the Bank of Canada cuts rates, you look at the short end of the curve where it says the overnight rate, that decreases in line with the Bank of Canada rate cut announcements. So you can see our forecast is that variable rate is going to continue to become cheaper throughout the year. However, when you look at the bond markets, and Canada is very highly correlated with the US. And what we're seeing in the US is that those longer term bonds, which would translate into your fixed rate debt of, if you're renewing your mortgage or taking on any new debt, that's going to be that 5-year fixed rate. The bond market in the US right now is not overly favorable with the conditions that are happening, whether it's their tariffs, their immigration policy, the big, beautiful budget, and the tax cuts. The bond market is building in a risk premium. So the main takeaway from this slide is where we are at right now with that 5-year fixed money, don't expect that to change much through to the end of this year. And so those fixed rates likely aren't going to become much cheaper than they are now. So that's something to balance out when you look at the short end of the curve or those variable rates. Our forecast is those are going to continue to decrease as the economy weakens. These fixed rates are tied to the bond market. Don't expect much movement in the rates through
Okay.
the year.
Okay. Now on to currency. So when we look at the Canadian dollar, we of course look at it head to head with the American dollar. This is the relationship that we all know and love. But there are some interesting things happening on the currency side, both of course with the American dollar, but whether or not the Canadian dollar actually has strength on its own or not.
Yeah.
So if we can go to the next slide, please, we'll look at where we're at with currency, and then of course talk currency outlook and currency risk for this year.
Yeah, so the dollar is, our forecast, it's going to be stuck between that 72 and 74 cent range through the year, which is a good news story from an export perspective, and as an exporting nation, like you mentioned, Lyndsey, a lot of the prices our commodities are priced in US dollars. So we actually get that exchange rate premium. So that does help, and it does flow all the way through to, producers when we look at margins this year. I know that, for, the grain and oilseed sector, very, very tight margins. But this will help, provide some of that little bit of boost because of our dollar in that 72 to 74 cent range. And as you mentioned as well, this is less about, what's happening in Canada and more about what's happening in the US. And that, if you go to the next slide, this is the one that captures that US dollar sentiment. So the figure on the left is a trade-weighted index of the US dollar. And what's happening and what you can see is that actually the US dollar is weakening. And so everything I talked about that's showing up in the bond market and those, with trade deficits, immigration policy, tariffs, that's weighing on the US dollar. So the US dollar, it's viewed as a safe haven currency. People are, they're moving away from it somewhat, and we're seeing that actually the weakness in the US dollar. And the figure on the right highlights the Canadian dollar, how it's performing against other currencies. And so actually our appreciation against the US dollar is the weakest, even comparing against emerging economies or advanced. And so this ties to the weakness we're seeing in the Canadian economy. So I mentioned GDP, the labor market, high household debt, all of that's weighing on the Canadian dollar. So this, it doesn't look good from a Canadian dollar perspective compared to other currencies. But again, when we're looking at diversifying our trade away from the US, this actually opens up opportunities that our dollar is more favorable when we are exporting to other nations outside of the US. So it does balance out and does provide some benefit to the Canadian economy and especially to producers. So I'd say kind of overall, I've summed up, it's very pessimistic this year, a lot of uncertainty, but I agree, resilience and optimism are something we need to focus on. And if we can get through this CUSMA review, and if everything kind of, happens as we think with what we've heard coming out of the US, I think we should be set up for the second half of the year for things to be a little more clear for producers.
So this, on the currency question, and I think, the graph on the right is quite telling that, it's the weakness of the US dollar, not the strength of the Canadian dollar, that's really sort of
Yeah.
causing this, right? And so you mentioned, and I really want to hit on this, like globally and with trades, it's not great news, the reason that our dollar is worth less because of course, or sorry, worth more, because of its weakness, but that does make us potentially more competitive on the global stage. Is that
Yeah.
how that works?
Yeah, that's the gist of the story. And it, sometimes it gets lost when you think about a weak dollar. It's like, it does, like I said, point to weakness of the economy. But when you look just solely at exports, this is where we see the benefit of not just into the U.S., but now into those other economies where we want to diversify our trade and sign agreements. This will actually help the producers from a revenue standpoint.
Okay. So to put it all sort of together, we started this conversation with, that the outlook is not overtly positive, but there are reasons to look a little further down the line and perhaps see, the light at the end of the tunnel here. Navigating this year, though, might be a rough ride. What are the key fundamentals you're watching to see just how quickly we might get to that light at the end of the tunnel, or just how sure that might be?
Well, we're going to watch definitely what happens with trade negotiations. And I would also point to, what Shaun highlighted in his video is finding those efficiencies and those cost savings. So every little bit matters. And I think that's what's critical for producers is what's in your control versus out of your control. And so focusing on efficiencies, innovation, productivity, all of that will help the ground level for farms and producers to really try to generate some more profit because trade negotiations are going to be ongoing. We don't have a lot of influence as far as on the ground level to influence those. So it's kind of separating out and just being mindful that when you dig beneath the surface of what's coming out of the White House, there is the general sentiment in the US that the CUSMA is a good agreement for both countries. So I think that's the kind of the light at the end of the tunnel. But that we have to wait through July before we really know what comes out of those discussions.
Mm-hmm. And finally, on that point as well, the graph is showing trade movement to the rest of the world. So outside of that, how significant is that? Like that hasn't necessarily been the norm. So do those numbers really add up?
They do add up. And so, we are still highly exposed to the US at probably, 70% of our trade goes to the US. But when you see the movement to the rest of the world, and keep in mind, those numbers would also include basically our canola market being shut out of China. And so I think it does highlight that we are finding these other opportunities. Trade diversification takes time. And, like I said, the federal government making investments in infrastructure is critical to continue because instead of now moving north and south, we need to start moving commodities to salt waters. We need all of the rail, trucking, and port facilities to continue to make sure that we have an efficient means to get these products to other countries. But the U.S. is still, it's a 300 million plus people that live really close to us. So that market is still really important. And so that's, highlighting the need to re-sign CUSMA. But it also highlights we are, maybe overexposed to the U.S. And so the diversification just really helps to balance out what's happening and across various countries with these trade disruptions.
Okay. Des, thank you so much.
Right.
Tyler, I'll
Thank
hand it
you.
back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lyndsey. Thank you, Des. And we'll bring the two of them back to wrap up the conversation at the end, and we'll get back to some of your questions. If you do have questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the Q&A function and put them into the chat. I'd like to bring in our next participant of the webinar today, and that is Francis Drouin. Francis is a respected public policy leader and former member of parliament. He's been in involved in 20 years at the intersection of politics, governance, and stakeholder engagement. He is now a senior advisor at Capitol Hill Group. While serving as the MP for Glengarry Prescott Russell for nearly a decade, he was appointed parliamentary secretary to the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food and was involved in some of the critical issues facing ag policy and politics over the last 10 years. So, Frank, thank you for joining us. Maybe start with kind of the simple question. If you go back to that poll question at the beginning, what's kind of the one word that you would use for your outlook for 2026?
Yeah, I think resiliency and uncertainty, if I can say two words, would be those words. Obviously, when you're looking at the news, and I still speak to farmers back home, and you're seeing some of the stuff that's coming out of the White House, I understand why the ag community would be concerned, especially when the majority of our ag exports are driven towards the U.S. I am a bit of an optimist. I would say that despite the fact that, of course, we are dependent to the U.S., we're still more diversified than other sectors of the economy. We, most of the economy, most of our exports on average is 75%, and the ag sector is at 60%. I am seeing some positive news from the government trying to diversify trade, and I think the ag community is responding to that. So that I see as a positive.
Now, you talked about things coming out of the White House, and that is part of what contributed to a kind of a pretty turbulent political year in 2025. We had kind of early on in the year, we had the Prime Minister announce he was stepping down. We had an election. It looked like the Conservatives were a shoo-in in January, and in the end, the new Prime Minister almost got a majority government. What do you think's in store for 2026 from a political perspective, and what do you think it means for the sector?
Well, I mean, if you're asking me whether or not there will be an election, I don't know, but I could see from a government perspective, and Tyler, you've been there, when you can't pass legislation, and if the numbers are favorable for you, I could see them trying to pull the plug at some point. At the end of the day, when you're on Parliament and government cannot pass legislation, then I could see some of the government members obviously being just running out of patience, but they will have to build that case to Canadians why they need necessarily an election now. But I am pessimistic about a potential election just because of what's coming down the pipe with regards to, I think, CUSMA review and the timelines that are coming down. So, I mean, the government could say, we'll wait to make sure that we try and either renegotiate or, depending on what the U.S. wants to do. There are midterms coming up in November with the U.S., so that could limit some of the nonsense that is coming out of the White House and creating uncertainty in the North American marketplace. So from a political perspective, and from the Conservatives as well, I mean, they obviously nobody is expecting that Pierre Poilievre will not be the leader of the opposition for now, and the leader of the Conservative Party after this weekend. I think he will do well there. But he is the Prime Minister in waiting, and rightfully so. He's saying, "I enjoyed your speech in Davos, but then the rhetoric has to match what you're saying." And I think that's the challenge for the government and for the Prime Minister is, the Liberals got a new captain of the ship. They got a new paint job, but they're still working with an old boat. And when I say an old boat, you've been there before. It's you're working with public servants, and I'm not accusing public servants, but the machinery of government is still heavy, and that takes time to changing that culture shift. And adding to that, the fact that all departments have had a mandate to cut expenses by 15%, that creates uncertainty within their own shops, if I can say that. So all of these components are creating challenges for the government inside government and the machinery of government.
And so we'll come back to that because I think that is a really important point. We'll come back to that with Greg after. But I'm curious as to what should our expectations be for the Prime Minister, for the government, for the political dynamics in 2026? Because is it, we talk a lot about the need for action, but in the face of all of these headwinds and all of these pressures, it kind of challenges getting things done inside government. Will he be able to meet the expectations for actions that Canadians have for him?
Well, I mean, if you're obviously you don't win election on foreign policy, but given the dynamics that are happening with the US, and I think Prime Minister Carney set a vision of what he is trying to accomplish. How much time are Canadians going to give him and allow him to accomplish that vision? Whether or not he is showing Canadians that he's signing more trade deals, and whether or not that is reflecting in the marketplace, I think those will be key elements to say that. Um, Key elements for the opposition to say perhaps that you have not done what you said you were going to do. Yes, you've signed some trade deals, but Canada is not taking advantage of it. Canadians are still feeling the cost pressures. I mean, affordability is still really it's still an issue within Canada. I mean, we've seen some food inflation issues. So government is trying to respond. The only danger I will say, and this is a trap that we have fallen into, when I say we, the previous government had fallen into, is if you are trying to solve every issue in Canada, you will get into problems politically. And because housing, for instance, we know housing. I mean, the former prime minister got in trouble with that because you're constantly the face, and then the finger gets pointed at you. Why is the cost of housing rising? It's just because of the federal government, even though the federal government has a role to play, but not necessarily the entire role to play, right? So I would say that's the danger of the government if they're trying to issue management their way out of a crisis every time, as opposed to setting a vision and saying no occasionally. And a lot of the expectations when I'm looking at China, a lot of folks were saying, we're not sure if there's going to be a deal for the canola sector. Not perfect, but a lot of folks were not too optimistic, especially when the premier in Ontario was kind of kicking and screaming and saying, hey, don't you dare sell my auto jobs in Canada, right? So he has to, I mean, any prime minister has to weigh into these issues that are not necessarily unifying in Canada and regional issues, but has to make a decision. And I think that's the core difference between this current prime minister versus the previous one. I think PM Carney is just saying, I'm making the decision, a quick decision, and whether you agree with it or not, I don't care. I'm moving with this, and this is my way, and I'm moving ahead with this particular decision.
And I think that's an interesting one because I guess, like, are you surprised of the decisions that he's making? Because he did choose, arguably, kind of Western canola farmers over Ontario auto manufacturers. He did choose, in theory, a pipeline and kind of oil and gas in Alberta over kind of the environmental concerns and kind of the positions there. Are you surprised by the choices that he's making? What do you think that means looking at 2026?
I mean, I've always considered myself as a blue liberal, so I'm happy with those. But I can see that perhaps in my former caucus, some caucus members are, and I mean, you've seen it with the former Minister of Culture resigning from cabinet. Surprised? No, but at the same time, is it justifiable to say that you've sold out the auto sector when it represents less than 3% of the entire Canadian market, right? So that I think he's looking at those numbers and saying, well, you can criticize me, but at the end of the day, the numbers are on my side. And I think that was the right decision, the right play to make. And restoring a relationship with China, as always said, it's a nice to have. We're stuck in between kind of the U.S. and China globally, and we're kind of the ping pong table sometimes. But I think this was welcoming news. I'm hearing it was kind of not a last minute decision, but even in China, when the PM or the plane arrived on site, those decisions weren't necessarily done. And those of you who deal in China, you know that the decision making is a really top down. Officials will not start working on issues unless the top person says you need to start working on those issues. So I think that's a good sign. But we need to see more trade diversification from the Prime Minister and the government of Canada in the near future.
Great. And so we'll come back. Frank,
Yep.
Thanks for starting this part off. We'll come back to some questions about where does agriculture fit in that bigger picture shortly, but we'll bring in Greg Meredith next. Greg is has been a senior official at Global Affairs Canada, Agriculture in Canada, and more recently served as the Deputy Minister in several Ontario ministries, including Agriculture, Economic Development, Trade, Labor, Immigration, training and skills development. Greg, I think I probably have smashed a bunch of departments there together. Greg's got a great track record as an accomplished results-oriented leader with a proven record of transformational change and achievement in ag policy, regulatory affairs, and international trade. Had the pleasure and challenge sometimes, Greg, of being on the opposite side of the table with you as you were kind of advancing some of those transformations in ag policy. But I'm curious, when you look at the year ahead and some of those decisions that Frank was just alluding to, there's some big decisions that are going to be made about the next policy framework, that 5-year deal. The July FPT meeting is going to be a key moment. I wonder, kind of, when you think about what's ahead there, what are the decisions that you're looking at, and when do you think those decisions are actually going to get made this year?
Well, first off, Tyler, let me say I really appreciate CAPI bringing this kind of discussion to people. I think it's really timely. It's really important work, not just for ag food, but overall, trying to influence the policy environment. So kudos to you and the team. Let me just say, at the outset, to set the context of my thinking, I'd pose a question, which is fairly straightforward. What have you seen in the past year that reassures you, and in you, but just generally reassures one that we have a stable policy environment going forward? And I'm speaking specifically about the United States. And in answering that question for myself, my answer is I see nothing that's normal anymore with the behavior of the American president, and the implications of that for things as important as CUSMA or the USMCA. So my perspective is a little bit more pessimistic about whether or not that agreement will come to fruition. And I think Shaun or Desmond, made it very clear just how critical that agreement is for ag food trade between the countries, but particularly for us on a southward flow basis. I think it's going to be a very fraught negotiation process within CUSMA. I think it's important to remember that aside from being exceptionally volatile and unpredictable, the president is also very transactional. And in other words, he doesn't see any deal as a win-win for anybody. Anything that the other side gains, he perceives as a loss. And that makes it very difficult to negotiate with him, even with the high caliber of trade policy negotiators we have. So I worry about a couple things. I worry that the opportunity for the president, as he would see it, is to use CUSMA negotiations to get other concessions out of Canada, and whether that is concessions on issues of sovereignty or more pointed issues like our supply managed sectors. I don't really know, but I do expect that there will be a series of outlandish demands or claims or requests that will populate the discussion. And I think that injects a great deal of uncertainty about the outcome. The other thing I would add to explain my pessimism about the eventual stable outcome of a CUSMA negotiation is that the president doesn't seem to be constrained by the norms of bilateral agreements or global multilateral institutions. So I think the key word used by a couple of our commentators was uncertainty. So you get to a CUSMA deal. In the past, that would mean a great deal of certainty, a great deal of visibility, a clear time frame for the rules of engagement on trade to be in place. None of that is to be expected this time around. So even if we got to an agreement, I think it's as volatile or uncertain as the president's own behavior. So that makes me very, very concerned about the likelihood of a solid outcome of CUSMA within a reasonable amount of time. And even if we got that the persistent uncertainty and the persistent chipping away at the rules of behavior and rules of engagement by the president will create a great deal of uncertainty in the country. The other issue that I've raised with you before in some of our interactions lately, Tyler, is the worrisome perseveration by the president on supply management. I had a discussion just last week with a number of innovative dairy farmers, Southern Ontario, and the concern, of course, is that in this transactional nature of the president's approach, that he targets a sector like dairy, which has been on his mind for some time, and holds Kuzma hostage to a very substantial concession in market access, particularly in the dairy world. So that is another source of uncertainty from my perspective for Canadian and Ontario, Quebec agriculture in particular. Whether or not the new policy framework can address some of those issues, I think is a very big question. But let me just set the context for your listeners. That this agreement expires end of March in 2028. So that seems like a long way away, but there's a series of engagements, FedProv, that have to take place over the course of the next 2 years. I think the fact that CAPI is out talking about these things is really important, and I applaud you for that. Likewise, CFA has an engagement exercise ongoing, and it's good to see that the sector leadership is getting engaged on this, because I do think it's an unprecedented opportunity to really unify Canadian agriculture in the face of all these uncertainties. But we got to get going. We got to go fast, because the way this set of negotiations works towards an agreement is there has to be a multilateral agreement amongst all players, and then that has to be translated into bilateral agreements. So there's a series of agreements between each province and the federal government. It takes a lot of time. It's very process heavy. And so if it's an opportunity for significant policy engagement and change, then you got to get started early, and you got to have a real Team Canada approach. So that leads me to, what could we do in the multilateral agreement and bilateral agreements under a new sustainable Canadian agriculture policy that could help re-establish some certainty in the environment. One would certainly be to look very carefully at the productivity in the sector. Look at what our friend Shaun pointed to with respect to investments in machinery and capital and the uptake of technology, and try to remedy that, try to turn that curve around. I get that individual farmers are making financially sound decisions by delaying machinery purchases, by delaying technology uptake, by delaying introduction of innovative inputs and practices, but that's not healthy for the sector. So I think, globally speaking, you've got to see a major investment in innovation, in capitalization, in productivity enhancements on farm, but also in the supply chain. There is an opportunity in the context of the threat around us to say, let's establish, first of all, the most productive farms in the world. Let's establish freer trade within Canada. As most of your viewers will know, there was a significant push by virtually every province and the government of Canada towards freer internal trade, but it excluded food and it excluded many agriculture products. And so this is not a healthy economic environment when we have so much opportunity for significant additions to GDP growth simply by trading better in Canada and by improving efficiencies in the sector and productivity enhancements in the sector. I think the Prime Minister has kind of quite rightly established that it's probably pure nostalgia to think things are going to go back the way they were. I don't think they will. I think that is the overhang on CUSMA negotiations, and it's the overhang on our ongoing relationship with the United States. I'm not as sanguine about as some that the midterm elections next November will change that channel as completely as we hope. But I remain, optimistic that I can be surprised.
So Greg, you're seems like you're pessimistic about the outlook right now. You're optimistic that you may be surprised. Are you optimistic that agriculture ministers and agriculture departments will be able to respond kind of the way that you talked about, that will respond with a more focused policy framework and 5-year agreement coming out of this context? Are you optimistic that we're going to do that, or will we see the status quo continue on?
A few months ago, I would have said I'm not optimistic, given that there was a conscious decision to, not free up internal trade in food. But I think one of the things that we can't forget is that it's a crisis that creates the opportunity for significant change and including policy change. And I think more and more we are all recognizing we are in somewhat of a crisis, that our dependence on the United States and on the rules of engagement globally and bilaterally are no longer the safe harbor that they used to be for middle powers. So I think that there's a real opportunity amongst ag ministers, provincially and federally, to seize that uncertainty and say we need real change this time around. I'm hopeful that most of the sector leadership are also seeing things that way, saying to themselves, this opening of the policy framework and renewal and refresh of CUSMA are opportunities for us to do new things and do them differently. And I do think from CAPI's own guidance, it's useful for people to turn back to that SCAF, the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Agri-Food report about regulatory reform. These are issues that have been plaguing agriculture productivity in Canada for decades. And they put a really sharp spotlight on the opportunities to unwind some of that regulatory red tape, do things faster, better, more efficiently, and speed the introduction of new technologies, for example, speed the opening up of internal trade, and help to diversify our global markets. So it's a real opportunity for sector leadership to kind of challenge ministers to be innovative and to be much more aggressive in adopting new practices. So I'm really hopeful that we won't let this crisis uh, pass without seizing the opportunity it creates.
Thanks, Greg. And Frank, it's good to bring you back. I think going back, let's talk about SCAF reports again for a minute. You've sat around that table, and I think the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Food's got a good reputation of being relatively kind of friendlier maybe than some other committees, although it hasn't always been the case. But I guess my sense has been, looking at the work done on regulatory reform, is that really was a pretty kind of cross-party issue where whether or not you're a Liberal member, a Conservative member, a Bloc member of the committee, you kind of agree that changes need to happen, and yet that doesn't always seem to be enough. I'm curious as to kind of, when you look at these agriculture issues where there is kind of broad support for action, and we still struggle to see it. Is there something that can change? Do you have any hope that will lead to actual action on this in 2026?
I think that the government is working extremely hard on the trusted jurisdiction with other trading partners right now to see how we could how that would look. I mean, I wouldn't look towards CDC on the other side, but I mean, I on the with other jurisdictions where that there are key champions in the government that are trying to do that. My concern with the report, which is a good report, I think now's the time for the ag sector to look at those 20 some recommendations and say, okay, where do we put the 5 priorities that we want? I think PMRA is one of them, that putting a new mandate, right? Not just a scientific mandate, but also an economic mandate without losing the public trust on that side, because PMRA will say, well, we need to, ensure that there is public trust out there in the sector, so we can't be seen too much cozying up. But there are some economic issues that arise from their certain decisions, and I think that in those recommendations around putting that economic lens towards the without sacrificing health or human health, I think that's an important one. And if they can get that mandate in there, that will be, I think, a winner for the entire sector. And my only suggestion for opposition party is keep the pressure on the government to do that, because as you know, a report is a report, but if nobody talks about that report after, it's going to get tossed aside, and then the government may not necessarily, because they've got so many X priorities to compete with. So if we keep the heat on, then and on the government, then I think they will move on some of these things that was highlighted in the report.
And do you think that kind of regulatory reform is one of these spaces where we're likely to see kind of decisions made that would be broadly supported in the agriculture sector? Or like, is this where the low-hanging fruit is, or do you see the kind of other opportunities for action that ag would like to see?
I mean, given the perspective of the Minister of Health, where CFIA and PMRA kind of reports to, it's and one of my former colleagues has alluded to this. The Minister of Health comes in, is named, and then the last thing she's thinking about is like, oh, I'm responsible for food safety and I'm responsible for pesticide regulatory issues. She's thinking about how many doctors, how many nurses, how many health transfers, and then provinces are rightfully barking at that. So I think one of the recommendations to maybe repatriate CFI under ag, that might be a win for the sector, because I've always said agriculture is kind of the concierge service for ag issues. You've got issues with labor. Well, it's not necessarily the Minister of Labor who's going to hear about it. It's the Minister of Agriculture that's going to hear about it and is expected to kind of concierge through the department and through the intergovernmental issues department issues that happen within the government. So having that ability to move CFI, I think, under ag, I think that would be a good first step to demonstrate to industry that they are serious about doing something.
Now, the unfortunate reality is that the action that we've actually seen so far in 2026 is reductions in staff at Ag Canada and CFIA. So we knew that was inevitable. The government had announced that in November. I think we're still, the Ag Canada cuts were announced a week ago. CFIA cuts announced earlier this week. We still don't have a very good picture of what that looks like. But again, we've got a question that's come in already asking about, with these reductions at Ag Canada and CFIA, is there a chance that we're going to lose global competitiveness and slow down a system that's already acting pretty slowly? And so Frank, get your perspective on that. And then Greg, curious as to your thoughts around what these cuts might mean for the system. But Frank, do you want to start?
Yeah, I would argue not necessarily through CFIA. And if we're talking about non-trade barriers, I think there was a budget commitment to CFIA to start working on those. So I think I'm hopefully going. I think there's a few $20-some million dedicated to that, which I think this is good news. So obviously, I wouldn't see the government cutting in that particular sector. I know research has been, obviously some research centers have been making the news recently. I think that the government in the next day or the next week will be explaining to stakeholders what the issue is. I don't think that the minister would say, I know Heath, I think he would say, how do I minimize? I know I have to cut my department by 15%, but how do I minimize impact to producers? Hopefully that there are smart people at Ag Canada and they're saying, bricks and mortars are the most expensive things that exist, but are they able to reorganize that research somewhere else without having to lose what research was done in that particular center? I hope, and I'm thinking this is what the rationale behind it, and that's what they're doing. But that I'm assuming this will be explained in the near future to stakeholders and probably CAPI very shortly.
And I think that there's lots of people looking for that information. But Greg, in 2012, when the government went through this last time, you were one of those smart people that Frank was just talking about, that was explaining to people like me on the other side of the table how to kind of go about these cuts. And what's your sense of the priorities that are being made and what impact these reductions have and what that might mean for where things go the rest of the year?
Well, first of all, I have to say, I think it is time for a bit of renewal in the federal government. And by that, I mean, trimming it down, taking a hard look at what's really working and what isn't. If departments come out a bit smaller as a result, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. For example, in our case, the case we're talking about today with the renewal of CUSMA and the renewal of the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnership, this government needs to invest heavily in the kinds of infrastructure that are going to favor, new ports, new rail, new transportation, and they're going to have to invest in new technologies to do things faster and better to deal with this new world that we're living in. I happen to think that um, there's huge opportunity, huge GDP gains to be had in a smarter food safety system. I don't think adding more people is necessarily the smartest way to achieve a better outcome in food safety or, for that matter, in the safety of inputs through PMRA. I really do believe that the kinds of pressure that these departments and agencies are facing will stimulate innovation in the bureaucracy. The food safety space is one that is, in my views, quite sclerotic and has been for a very long time. Our ability to examine and approve new technologies is behind virtually every OECD country in terms of time and in terms of transparency. It's hugely expensive for the creators of new technologies in the ag space to get approval in Canada, and they often won't even try. So, to put our farmers on a more competitive basis, I think a trimmer, faster moving, more agile CFIA is probably a good thing with some additional pressure to innovate, to get rid of unnecessary behaviors and procedures that are really historically rooted. And of course, as Frank quite rightly pointed out, putting human health and animal health at the top of the list. But I think you can do that better, faster, by being smarter and not necessarily by being bigger.
And it's an interesting dynamic because I think one of the challenges is kind of the public perception and the pressure on governments to do things like not cut inspectors. I think people always get their backs up when they see the number of inspectors going down. When often there's an argument to be made that we maybe should be cutting inspectors or should be shifting inspectors around.
We're doing inspection in a better, smarter way. The
Mhm.
technologies that are available today, Tyler, when you and I were across the table many years ago, they were unheard of.
Right.
So, are we a leader in the adoption and use of new technologies for food safety applications? I do not think so. I think there's a lot of old think. I do think there's an opportunity, by the way, for provinces and the federal government to have another look at the hodgepodge, the quilt patchwork of food safety inspection across the country and harmonize that stuff. The amount of time and effort that food companies have to put in to comply with different regulations in different jurisdictions, some of those jurisdictions being, basically big cities with, a different way of doing food and doing food safety. I just think there's, great opportunity and greater collaboration. That could be part of the ag framework discussion as well.
But Greg, like some of these decisions take some political risk, and I think one of the things that's been interesting with the current prime minister is that he has taken risks. Or you talk about that deal with Alberta on pipelines and energy, and we talk about kind of choosing canola over kind of auto jobs in theory. Like there is risks there. Is the government prepared to take risks when it comes to agriculture issues? Is it prepared to potentially ruffle some feathers about kind of how decisions are made or how regulations are changed or how policy priorities are made? Do you think that the government's prepared to take some risk in 2026?
Well, that's what I was saying about the crisis and why you need to seize this opportunity, right? At normal times, I would say no. People are happy. They think their food is safe. They're sure their food is safe. The rate of adoption of new technologies, seems to have gone off the public radar as a risk, as a kind of concern for people. So In normal times, I would say probably not. That the risk of upsetting what seems to be a stable apple cart is too high and too politically risky. I would say the opposite calculation is what's going on in some minds in Ottawa and provincial capitals, which is the risk of not changing is going to be very, very high politically. You've got to get some results. You've got to show that you're moving forward. You've got to be willing to adopt different ways of achieving better outcomes, or I think you're going to be politically dead. And you can see the pressure on this government, despite the Prime Minister's personal popularity. The Conservatives and the Liberals are very, very close in the polling. So um, the Prime Minister has set very high expectations for himself. And people are saying, somewhat unreasonably, how come you don't have an agreement with the United States so far? Why haven't you rewritten the rules for global trade alliances? You've been there for almost a year. Now, these things take time, right? But I think people are not patient right now. They want results. And I think the risk of inaction or slovenly action is going to be higher than moving quickly in a smart way.
Greg, do you think government's going to move quickly, but in a smart way?
I think they have no choice, and I think there's a willingness for provinces to play as well. I mean, I know they're meeting today, but going back to Greg's example in terms of in the food inspection industry, you've got a shortage of inspectors. We know that our CFI inspectors and OMAFRA inspectors collaborated during COVID. You mean to tell me that eating meat from a provincially regulated plant is not as safe as eating meat from a CFIA plant? If we have a shortage of CFIA inspectors, then let's work with those provinces that necessarily may not have the same resources as Ontario, Quebec, or other larger provinces would had. Stick those resources over there, and that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of innovation I want to see. But I think those types of recommendations, I don't think will come from the public service themselves. This has to be politically driven, and perhaps there are a lot of Greg Merediths in the public servants, and I would be looking for them to transform the bureaucracy. But that type of thinking has to take has to be leading the conversation. And I think there is an opportunity with. Yes, there was a GST or HST announcement not too long ago, but there was a national food security strategy. I think within there, this is where you can have those conversations and plug those in and drive those and continue pounding on all governments to say, we need change because it's cost too much money to do business in the food industry in Canada right now.
So we're going to bring Des and Lyndsey back in a minute, and because we've got a popular CUSMA question, so we'll come back to that. But before we talk CUSMA again, what other landmines that we've not talked about are things that you're worried about, or you think that we should be prepared about in 2026? So go to you first, Frank, and then go to Greg.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's talking about CUSMA, but before CUSMA, we were all talking about Asian influenza or African swine flu. I think disease is still very possible in terms of a huge risk. And I hopefully this doesn't materialize, but I know that the ag sector, the Pork Council has been doing an extremely good job at getting prepared. But AFS, I mean, there's plans in place, but you can have the best laid plans, but until you actually action them, those are tough to predict. And I think that could be like a landmine for the ag sector that nobody's kind of talking about, except obviously in the Chilliwack region where they're continuing to deal with this on a daily basis. But I think that could be a potential risk that we're not necessarily talking about, but it's present.
And Greg, what about you? What about a landmine that you're thinking about?
Well, it's a bit of a riff off of what I was saying earlier, Tyler, about the concerning observations that Desmond and Shaun pointed to in terms of the capacity of the sector to invest, to have the capital formation to innovate and grow. And I do think there's a risk that the discussion with the federal government and provinces on a new agreement can descend into how much more money can we put into risk management to transfer to farmers. And the reason I say it's a risk is I think there needs to be a wholesale generational investment in technology and innovation in the ag sector. I think this is a perfect time to do it, to set us up for, many, many years ahead of us in growth of productivity and efficiencies. The example that Francis or Frank just made is a great one about, the risk of disease. Well, one of the mitigating solutions to devastating disease outbreaks is to have the science underway to prevent it. And we're not just talking about, avian or African swine flu, but other pests that are marching northward. I'm thinking of the vineyards down in Niagara-on-the-Lake or the Niagara region and vineyards elsewhere in the country that are at great risk from new pests. What are we doing as a country to deal with that? And are we at risk of funneling money away from those kinds of really critical investments, sector saving investments, to sweeten the pot on business risk management? So that's a worry in the year coming ahead.
And I think it's an interesting worry, Greg, because the reality is, I think by all accounts, and Desmond, I'll start with you on this, but 2026 is going to be a tougher year for farmers than for the average farmer than what we've seen in a long time. And I go back to kind of the time of the Harper government, the time of the Trudeau government. Both of those prime ministers saw pretty good years from an agriculture perspective. Farm income was pretty strong. I think it took some of the pressure off. You go back to 2012, the agri-stability trigger was lowered from 85 to 70%. And there was not much concern about that change at the time because by and large, farmers were profitable. But how do you think that that's going to kind of play out, and how tight do you think things are going to get for farmers when you look at the potential for farm margins this year?
Yeah, so I think it varies. If you're in crops, it's going to be a very tight year margin wise. Shaun had talked about costs. We're forecasting overall farm expenses this year will be up 4% this year, and even into next year, still increasing farm expenses. Commodity prices have really softened. So we've talked about crop prices, lentil prices have dropped by probably 50%. So margins are going to be really tight. So I think Greg talked about productivity, and that's one area where a farmer does have control. Efficiency, scale, innovation. You have to really make those investments. And so when you hear the sentiment and producers not wanting to invest, this is preventing that productivity. And so how do we get over that hurdle to make them realize this is a good investment? This will help their margin. So focusing on those costs is critical because we're at kind of the mercy of the global markets right now. And production-wise, globally this year was really, really strong. Canada had record production. So focusing on productivity is key. It was highlighted in the budget. It's just really moving the needle on for farmers to adopt that technology.
And Frank, what do you think the impact of softer farm margins and potential kind of losses on farms across the country is going to have on farm politics in 2026?
Well, it's here we are in winter time, and what type of crop am I going to plant? I feel for them, and especially it gets add to that bad weather events that happen. I completely understand why some folks would just say, you know what, I'm just going to sell the farm, and I don't want to live this stress anymore. And governments will have to be attentive to these types of issues happening, and especially if they are trade related. How quick can governments respond to those particular issues? Can they respond to those particular issues? And as we know here, ag is always, it's a cost share expenses with the government. So, 60% federal and 40% provincial. So those, it's good news in some ways, but in some ways it's sometimes an excuse for finger pointing between provinces and federal governments to say, well, you do something, no, you do something. So that I think there is a willingness for all of them to work together and make sure that the government does have the resources to respond to some crises that may arise in the future. But as Desmond said, I mean, the economics are somewhat scary, and I hope that there are BRMs in place right now that should respond to some of those crises, and that's the good news, and they're fully funded. But are they responding fast enough? That's always the critic that the governments get.
Greg, do you think we're going to see more finger pointing this year?
Well, like I said earlier, I'm optimistic that there's enough fire under everybody's behind that they'll work together to try to, get the most out of the ag sector that we can. And you got to support farmers to do that. If the bankruptcy numbers start to creep up, it's going to be very hard for governments to say we're not sweetening the pot. But you don't want to eat the seed corn, right? Like you got to invest for the future. So it would have to be smart, have to be like a Team Canada approach, not to be cliche about it. But I would expect and hope that the farm leadership would also understand where they should be putting their pressure on governments to act in the interest of the sector. So that's kind of having your cake and eating it too, I know. But what I like I said, what I worry about is a wholesale reinvestment in risk management income supports to the expense or to the detriment of really strategic investments.
Lyndsey?
So I've been watching the Q&A, and there are some fantastic questions coming in there as well. But they hit on a few things. Darcy Pollock's got a good point. There's a few other issues. I think there's two things that I think are really key for the next few months and, of course, going forward. One of them is exactly, Darcy makes the point about, okay, so we know we need to do certain things. We know we need to move quickly. We know we need to move into provincially. Do we actually have, to Greg's point, that fire under us to actually work across party lines, across provincial lines, and actually get some of the things done that need to get done? I'm skeptical because I'm cynical, but I would really hope that we're at a point that, to not waste a crisis and actually use this to leapfrog forward. There's another question too, and I think this is a really key one. I, of course, work in the media space, in the communication space, and if you don't spend a ton of time on social media, bless you, you're very lucky. We have a significant amount of misinformation, disinformation, and pushback from our consumers that it is really difficult to get actual facts out there, to actually have intelligent debates and conversation about the decisions that we need to make. And I'd love to know from our panelists, how do we navigate this world of, incredibly conflicting versions of events and the noise out there? Maybe Frank, I'll start with you.
Great question. I mean, it's something that I've been talking about for 10 years amongst the ag communities. How do we broadcast that message outside of our community? I mean, I've always said I can put a press release out in the Ontario back home. I mean, in Ontario, the Ontario farmer will pick it up, but I'm speaking to an audience that is already convinced. So how do we communicate to urban Canada, because all political parties, including the Conservative Party, need that infamous GTA if they want to form government, and you need to communicate to them. And I think food is a way to talk to Canadians, to Joe and Jane Ports that are not necessarily on the farm. The disinformation and misinformation out there, it's and including AI generated videos that are realistic. I mean, there is no thing that moves as quickly as social media. So I always say, if something seems too good to be true, perhaps that it ain't, and wait for, if you hear about a government announcement, but it has not yet, you saw it on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever, it's always good to see the source and where it's coming from and going directly to the source. Obviously, the government of Canada still communicates in the old-fashioned way. They will have a press release out, it seems cynical, but at the end of the day, you know that it's official if it's coming directly from a department or an agency like FCC, right? So.
But in the meantime, and maybe Greg, for you, like the years, I don't think starting off very well when it comes to information and kind of this challenge around disinformation. I think there's lots of kind of rumors floating around over the last week around what's actually getting cut, what the impact of the cuts are. Government has not been quick to clarify that. CFIA has lost control of a traceability file that they've been working on for 20 years, and that's kind of got out of their control. Greg, can governments respond fast enough to act in the way that Francis did? Is this going to be a big issue in 2026 if governments can't deal with it?
Well, to the question, can they act fast enough? No. But I do think Frank's quite right about the credibility of the source. So that's always, you got to leverage that, right? I don't know quite how I would recommend doing that, but you do have to leverage the authority of the government voice. But there's a slightly more to me concerning element with respect to what Lyndsey's raised, and that is the division, the social division that it creates. And we're, like I say, we're going to have to be united in how we approach not just the ag sector, but virtually all our relationships with the rest of the world. And being united is increasingly challenging. And I think the fuel for that fire is social media and the lack of a coherent set of tools to help people discern what's true and what's not. And like I say, I think that's feeding an underlying erosion of cohesiveness in the society that's going to be really challenging for governments to combat.
And Des, how do you kind of work that into your modeling, that understanding of what's actually likely to happen or not? And sort of a question that came up that's quite popular is, one, is there a general sense of an odds of CUSMA renewal or not? So I'm not sure if you've modeled that or not, and have you actually done some work around scenario planning for if there is no CUSMA or not? But how do you kind of think about this in the context of kind of the noise that's out there?
Yeah, it definitely one of the challenges is modeling in an environment or creating forecasts with all of the uncertainty and not having historical data that we can use to leverage to understand what the future holds. So that's where we do the scenario. And so we are in the process of running some scenarios to say if CUSMA was not renewed as current agreement and there was maybe a flat tariff put across on 10%, what is the impact? So we're starting that work, but it's really that crystal ball of like, there will be an agreement, but it's just what does it look like? And I think, Greg, you'd mentioned about dairies come up. It was called out in the report that the Trade Representative Office in the U.S. sent to Congress, did call out dairy as an irritant. But it didn't seem like it was a blow up of the dairy system. And it was talking about, current CUSMA market access. And they want, kind of living into that. And they did call out some of the exports from Canada. So on the surface, it looks like it's some tweaks to it. Maybe, dairy might be something that they do negotiate. I think the challenge is what's coming out of the White House versus what you read in some of the reports is so different. And we talk about media. The media gravitates and grabs those headlines of 100% tariff on all Canadian exports. That's not necessarily the reality, but it creates a lot of noise and uncertainty. So how do you get all of the information out there for consumers and producers to really understand what's happening? So I think that is the challenge is news doesn't necessarily dig into the details. They kind of, just catch those, headlines that catch people's attention.
Yeah.
Can I add something, Tyler, just
Sure.
on that, especially on CUSMA? I mean, the bad news, we have to talk about it again. The good news is that all of our ag associations and some of those people are still there, went through this back in 2018. And I have been down in the U.S. forging and reigniting some of those relationships for since even before Trump came to power last year. And I think that's the good news is that Canada has been used to this kind of chaos for, if I can call it that, but I think if I can say something positive, is that I'm happy to see that they are all working together, and including if you look at some of the press releases that the U.S. ag associations are putting out, they're telling their representatives, don't touch that, like leave this alone, right? So that's the positive news that I see, despite the rhetoric and the riffraff between our politicians.
Okay, and so let's end on a bit more of that positive note. We'll go around the table, so to speak, and I'd like everybody to say what's kind of one positive action that we can take in 2026 to make the year a better year. Greg, we'll let you go first. What's one concrete thing that we can do in 2026?
Totally within our control, internal trade. Just better, faster, more cohesive regulatory environment across the board to ignite the supply chain in ag and food.
Great. Frank, what's one thing?
The one thing I was going to say was that, but the second thing I'll say is reg reform within the federal government.
Okay. Des, one thing from your perspective?
I think Canada's done a great job of, that Canada first mentality. I think continuing that this year, we've seen a big shift into Canadians buying local, trying to avoid some of the products coming to the US. I think if that continues, that will be something that will still help to support the sector as we navigate through this year of, pick your word, uncertainty, chaos. I think that's one thing as well that will help support producers.
And Lyndsey, to you, what's one thing you're looking for people to do in 2026?
Listen more. Don't listen to respond, listen to hear, and think before you respond.
Lyndsey, it seems like that may be the hardest of all that
Yes.
are out there, but the most within our control. I'd like to thank Greg and Francis and Des and Lyndsey for joining me, and hopefully I thank everyone for listening. Hopefully they did listen to engage, and if you want to listen to more, please sign up for the CAPI mailing list. You'll get to hear about more things that we've got coming on, including, again, an outlook on that geopolitical context next week. And so stay tuned for more of that. This webinar will be up on YouTube soon. Please share it with your network. Again, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to Lyndsey, and thank you to all of our spectators. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.